Welcome to Independence Nation on the Light of Life Network. The article reads, "Segregation is back in schools." Now, this is unbelievable. I don't know if I agree with this here. Segregation is back in U.S. schools. The article reads, 60 years after the Supreme Court ruled that segregated public schools were unconstitutional, a new university report has found that many of the gains of integration have been reversed. In a report published Thursday by the Civil Rights Project at UCLA, researchers found that while schools aren't as segregated as they were before the landmark of Brown versus the Board of Education ruling in 1954, much of the progress had been made after 1967 has been lost. According to the Associated Press, just 23% of African American students went to schools that were majority white, a number that hasn't been lower since 1968. Meanwhile, more African Americans are attending schools in which they are the majority race than has been recorded in the past few decades. Similarly, more than 50% of Latino students are going to schools in which they are the majority race. The statistics are even starker in specific states. In New York, Michigan, Maryland, and Illinois, more than 50% of black students attend schools where 90% of the institution is minority. The same is true for Latino students in New York, California, and Texas. Although there are various explanations for this development, the report's author, Gary Orfield, said one of the primary reasons is housing segregation, meaning that basic segregation to rural areas, which can keep minorities from moving into areas with a larger white presence. Neighborhood schools, when we go back to them, as we have, produce middle-class schools for whites and Asians and segregated high-poverty schools for blacks and Latinos, he said at the AP. Another reason noted by University of Kansas professor John Rory is that those with the ability to move out of poor areas to reach better school districts have chosen to do so for many years, leaving behind cash-strapped institutions that sometimes can barely afford to offer basic classes. For the American Civil Liberty Union's Dennis Parker, this means fewer opportunities for students to become more successful. Now we have with us on the line a guy by the name of Marcus. He is an independent contractor in real estate, and he's here to enlighten us more on this issue. Marcus, what do you think about this report that's come out saying that segregation is back in U.S. schools and that segregation is higher than it has been before? And is this something that is pertaining to housing segregation?
Well, first off, Keith, thanks for having me on the show again. I was here a while back. I just wanted to say thank you for having me back again. As far as the housing market goes, I think that it is a trickle effect of the education system. And our education system is separated amongst poor, middle class, and rich families. Ultimately, the housing sectors are separated as well. If you live in a lower housing area, you will ultimately go to a school which does not have the same amount of money coming into the community, and therefore it won't have the same education, liberties, and teachers and education that the rich and the middle class schools have.
Now, is this something that you believe that is intentional, or is this something that just has slipped through the cracks? And as you said, as we have more poor rural areas, and we have collective groups of people. When you have the poorer people, you have poorer schools. Is this intentional, or has this just slipped through the cracks of our intended or what we had hoped for our young people to all be educated?
I would say that more than anything, it is a glitch in the system. Our system was designed with many errors, and this is one that is a huge error in the system. 90% of
So though the education may be similar, it still has these cash straps areas of it. It said, I want to read a quote here in the article because I think it has a great significance. These are the schools that tend to have fewer resources, tend to have teachers with less experience, tend to have people who are teaching outside the area of specialty, and also denies the opportunities, the contacts, and the networking that occur when you're with people with different socioeconomic backgrounds. How does that speak to it? Does it bring a broader person into the aspect when you have the poor and the rich mixed together?
Well, I think to have a winning system, you must have all of the classes integrated. Each class must learn from each other. I also think that it's something that the segregation starts at home. They're teaching their kids a poor mentality. They may have grown up poor. Middle class people are teaching a middle class mentality. Rich people are teaching a rich mentality. And we have to learn to educate the parents first so that the parents can educate the children and they all together make better decisions as a family to get to the right schools. And our system must also take action and make sure that our kids are not left behind.
And I've often heard you speak about. Often you spoke to many people, and you've changed lives concerning the rich dad, poor dad that you often speak about. Can you give us a little bit of that? What's the difference between these poor families and these rich families? Where are they lacking, and how does that tie into this housing segregation that is spilling over into our schools?
Well, the poor are thinking like the poor. You know, they want to go out and they want to get these jobs. They want to rush into the market. Their parents are teaching them, hey, you may not be able to finish school. Go out there and find a minimum wage job. The middle class ultimately is teaching their kids to get into the private sector businesses, plants, steel mills, and things like that. And the rich are teaching their kids how to establish themselves by utilizing the poor and the middle class. Their education is based on utilizing other people's time, other people's money. Everything is about other people, and the poor and rich ultimately are already in a losing, the poor are already in a losing mentality. Poor is a mindset, and poverty is the state of being that goes with that poor mindset.
And I just want to read some more of the excerpts of this article. It says here, the latest UCLA report had some notable findings as well. It found that schools in the Northeast are more intensely segregated than they were before 1968. Elsewhere, the Midwest, West, and border state schools are much less segregated than in the 1960s, but more segregated when compared to the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, to me, this speaks of the income gap between the poor and the rich that has occurred because, as it states, after that fact, after the 1960s, as you say, as it says here, that it became more segregated. Do you think that has to do with this income gap of the wealthy, this large income gap now between the wealthy and the poor as the middle class has dissipated?
Yes, I think it does. I think that as you see the middle class dissipate and you see the growing gap between the rich and the poor, ultimately life as we know it will change. There are millions of people who are out of work. There are millions who have given up on work. And you have to remember that those parents that have given up are in the household with their children, teaching their children that give up mentality that has trickled down to their children. And ultimately, you see a lot less children graduating. And ultimately, in the future, you'll see the gap growing.
Well, it's something that you should mention, that more and more of our young people these days are not graduating. There's been record numbers in places such as New York, has been mentioned here. But I wanted to mention this as well because it came as quite a surprise that it says here in schools in the South, meanwhile, were the least segregated in the U.S. It says, contrary to many claims, the South has not gone back to the level of segregation before Brown, meaning for Brown versus the Board of Education. It has lost all of the additional progress made after 1967, but is still the least segregated region for black students. How can that be? Or is this kind of the numbers were so high back in those times for segregation that it cannot reach the level of segregation today, and since it wasn't very high for the Northeast, it seems higher now. Can you speak to that issue?
Yes, I think that what you have seen is exactly what you said. There has been such a high level of segregation in the South, and I also think that some of the segregation has been coded. Almost to the level of a private slavery. You have to remember that the South has no union system, and therefore they can give lower wages, which might appear that they're hiring people, and it might appear that things are growing in the South, but ultimately they're stagnated by their own will.
Well, Marcus, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to be here on Independence Nation. We definitely appreciate your wisdom on this issue concerning this segregation and our housing and which is spilling over into our schools. So once again, I'd just like to thank you for being here on Independence Nation.